why I'm here.
Yep.
How far back do you want to go?
Basically, Iraq was part of the Ottoman Empire. There was no such country as Iraq before 1920, 1921. It was just part of the Ottoman Empire, which was ruled by Turkey. The whole of Mesopotamia. As a shortcut, oil was discovered, which is what it's all about. Oil was discovered in 1904 or 8. Again, check your facts because I can't quite remember.
Sure.
I think it was 1908. We turned our navy over from coal burning to oil burning in 1910. In 1914, we decided to invade through Basra. It took 3 years because we didn't have all those lovely tanks and depleted uranium and cluster bombs that we've got now. It took us 3 years to fight our way up because for some extraordinary reason, the natives didn't really want us there. Anyway, we fought our way to Baghdad by 1917. There was something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was basically the French and the British carving up that area. A woman called Gertrude Bell, who was a friend and confidant of T. Lawrence of Arabia, actually drew the boundaries of Iraq. You sort of think, well, it's rather like somebody from there coming here and saying, well, we'll call that Wales, and we'll call that Scotland, and we'll call this England. And they can all each have their own governments and etc. Well, she drew Iraq and she drew Kuwait. Now, this was a tribal society. It had no conception of, being a united whole. It was Sunni, Shia, Christian, Maronite, Jew. A lot of people, a lot of different cultures made up Iraq.
Christian culture back then.
Oh yes, it's Christians as well. And we tried to install a king. If you get one of the invaluable books you can get is Robert Fiske's Great War for Civilization. I heartily recommend it. It'll give you far more detail than I'm giving you about this. The 3 kings we tried to impose upon them for over the next 30 years. Well, as they had no memory, no knowledge of kingship, they knew nothing about kings. They didn't want kings, so they kept on trying to get rid of them and chuck them out and think. Well, we basically gassed and bombed and murdered them for the next 30 years. This is the whole of the Iraqi people, irrespective of whether they were Sunni or Shia or whatever. And we used gas 60 years before Saddam was using gas. Winston Churchill thought it was a very good idea, and people were protesting, just as Brian Hoare and myself and others have done in Parliament Square, against the use of gas. He said the protesters should be shot. He didn't actually go ahead and shoot them, but he said they should be shot because he said we shouldn't be squeamish about using chemical weapons against uncivilized tribes, as he put it. Rather the same attitude as Mr. Blair and Mr. Brown have today. These are uncivilized people who have to be civilized and given a democracy, regardless of whether they want it or not. And if we kill 1 million of them in the pursuit of that democracy, that's just splendid. Same attitude. It's a kind of Eurocentric lunacy. And in fact, the only reason we want them to have a democracy is we want to control their oil. This is all it's ever been about. If there was no oil under the sands of Iraq, we wouldn't be there. If it was just desert with some tribes living a nomadic life along the Tigris, unless the Tigris was a river that we needed for some navigational purposes, we wouldn't, we just wouldn't be there. So we gassed them and we bombed them. Now we bombed them throughout the 20s, the 30s and the 40s. Mainly because it was cheaper than keeping a standing army there, because there were a number of rebellions, and it was much easier to just go and bomb all the outlying villages with a few. We didn't have a Royal Air Force at the time. We had I think it was the Royal Flying Corps, I think it was called. And a man called Bomber Harris, who later went on to flatten Dresden, learnt his trade there. He decided that dropping a few incendiary bombs, which is all you could carry from a small monoplane, was not, really was not very productive. What he did was he adopted transport planes so that you could throw out many, many, many more bombs. And a memo was put before Parliament in 1924. I may have got the word slightly wrong, but it went something like this, where the Arab and Kurd thought that if they could put up with a little noise, they could put up with a little bombing. Now they know what real bombing means in terms of casualties and damage. Within 45 minutes, an entire village via detached photos of Kushan al-Ajaza can be practically wiped out, and a third of its inhabitants killed or injured by 4 or 5 machines which offer them no real target, no opportunity to prove their worth as warriors, and no effective means of escape. That was 1924, as then, so now. No difference. This was later withdrawn, by the way, from Parliament, and another note was put in front saying that the Royal Air Force or the Flying Corps offered a humane way of dealing with uncivilized tribes. What they meant by humane is that you found the most difficult to get to village up in the hills, and you bombed that, just as a sort of example to the others that nowhere could they escape from us.
Yeah.
And this went on, as I say, through the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and in the 50s they had a nationalist revolution, which was a man called Qasim, an army officer, who managed to chuck us out, partly because we'd just had the war and it was, it's like chaos after the war. We had other things to think about. And he threw us out and instituted a national government, nationalised the oil, bad mistake. MI6 and the CIA promptly organised a coup. Well, he managed to last about 8 years, but they organised a coup eventually. They called it a communist coup, and about 100, 200 people of the leaders of the government were all slaughtered. And the Ba'ath Party was ushered in. Saddam Hussein, who had been an original member of the Ba'ath Party and was part of a coup against Qasim, had to flee to Egypt. Again, dates you're going to have to check out with Fisk and others. All of this information is freely available. He fled to Egypt. There was a great story that he'd swum the river with a bullet in his shoulder and all the rest of it. And in Egypt, he was trained by the CIA as a torturer originally. His stepfather had brought him up, and he was an appalling stepfather who beat the shit out of him as a child. And we all know it's terribly well documented what happens to children if they grow up being really severely abused. They grow up to be abusers themselves. And the pattern was added to which the society was a very brutal society. And he was infiltrated into the Ba'ath Party, wormed his way up to power, in the end murdered his way to the top. And then, throughout the 60s, 70s and 80s, he was supplied with weapons by us and the American, who thought he was splendid. He was our dictator in Iraq, and he controlled things, and we got the oil from him, and everything was fine and dandy. And then there were the Iranians, who had to be punished. Then we have to go back a bit again, sorry, this is jumping around a lot to get the full picture. In the 50s, there had been a democratically elected government in Iran, led by a man called Mossadegh. Mossadegh had been, as I say, democratically elected, but again, big mistake, he nationalised the oil field and said it's our oil and we wish to decide how it is used and what price we want to put on it, etc., 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 etc. And we can't have these Western oil companies coming in and, keeping the price artificially low, doing whatever they want to do, just making money out of our oil, basically. So again, CIA and MI6 organised a coup, he was overthrown, and the Shah was put in his place. The Shah was Shah Pahlavi Reza was put in place by the CIA and MI6. And he was again an incredibly brutal dictator, rather like Saddam. And he ran something called the Savak, which was very, very similar to the Gestapo, really no difference at all. I mean, torture and murder and all the rest of it, repression. And he was only overthrown when the Ayatollah, when the Iranian people just couldn't stand it anymore, and they somehow managed to have a popular uprising, and they chucked him out, and the Ayatollah came back. I am not in favour of theocracies. However, compared with what they'd been through, it was a natural revulsion against state, or dictators, autocracy. So they brought back the Shah. They brought back the Ayatollah. When that happened, they had to be punished. And Iraq and Saddam was encouraged to invade. And there was then the most massive war, which went on for, I can't remember how many years. Again, check with Fisk, it's all in Fisk's. But about 1 million people on both sides died. I mean, it was the most appalling war. 2 million people at least died. Kissinger notably remarked that it would be a very good thing if all the Iranians and all the Iraqis could kill each other completely. That would be the best result. But then Mr. Kissinger is possibly the biggest unhung war criminal on the face of the planet. He murdered 1 million people in Cambodia, totally illegal bombing, and he should have been hung years ago. Instead, he is still very much part of the American scene. So that is, in 5 very brief minutes, the history of what we've done to the peoples of Iraq. We've been killing them for 93 years. It's now 2007 and we started in 1914. And that's why I'm standing in it. But I'm not also just that. I'm also standing because of the weapons we're using. The weapons we are using are so revolting.